I set up my tent in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the trailhead. The ground was soft and slightly damp from an early morning rain, but I liked that. It made the forest smell rich and alive. I'd been hiking all day, carrying a pack heavier than I should have, and when I finally picked this spot, the quiet was immediate. The clearing was surrounded by a mix of pine and fir, their branches interlaced enough to block most of the fading light. I worked slowly, staking down the corners and setting up my sleeping bag, feeling a relief I rarely felt outside the city. There was no one around. I hadn't seen anyone since the trail split from the main path hours back. Birds chirped overhead, the occasional squirrel scurried along the fallen branches, and for a moment, the isolation felt like a kind of peace. I finished setting up and took a long walk down the faint path that led deeper into the woods, trying to stretch my legs after sitting with my pack for most of the morning. The forest was dense but manageable. The sunlight filtered through the trees in narrow beams, and I could hear water running somewhere in the distance, a creek or small stream. I stayed out for an hour, taking note of the surroundings, noting possible landmarks in case I needed to find my way back in low light. When I returned to the clearing, the first hint of unease came subtly. Something about the tent felt off, but I couldn't place it. The air had cooled faster than I expected. Shadows were longer, more distinct. My mind tried to explain it. Maybe the angle of the sun, maybe the dampness, maybe my own fatigue, but there was still a sense that something had changed. I approached the tent and froze. Sticks were placed around it, in a circle. Thin sticks, some broken, others snapped neatly, stuck into the ground with care. They weren't there when I had left. I remembered clearly checking the ground before I walked, making sure the area was free of debris, and there had been nothing. The sticks formed a complete ring, and the spacing between them suggested someone had been deliberate, not haphazard. My first reaction was disbelief. Maybe the wind had knocked some branches down, but the arrangement was too precise. I stepped closer, carefully examining the circle. There was no sign of footprints or other disturbance in the surrounding dirt. No other signs of anyone having been here. I sat on my sleeping bag and tried to rationalize it. Maybe another camper had passed through, seen the spot and decided to mark it in some strange ritual I didn't understand. I had been alone all day, but that didn't mean someone couldn't have been in the woods nearby, silent and careful. My stomach tightened as I realized how little I knew about the forest outside of the trails. I had my knife in the pocket of my jacket and my flashlight in the tent. I kept my pack close. I didn't sleep much that night, though I tried, lying on my side and listening. The wind shifted occasionally, making the trees whisper. An owl hooted in the distance. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped under the weight of some animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I pretended it was all normal, but my eyes kept flicking to the circle of sticks, which seemed to grow larger in my imagination each time I looked. When morning came, the light was muted under thick clouds, and I decided I wouldn't stay another night. I packed slowly, keeping an eye on the surrounding woods. The sticks remained. No one was there. The ground bore no marks other than my own from when I had walked around the tent the night before. I lifted my pack and started down the trail, constantly glancing over my shoulder, but the forest seemed empty. Every shadow, every curve of the path made me tense, convinced for a moment I would see someone standing there watching. Hours later, back on the main trail, I saw the first sign of human activity since I had left the parking lot. A group of hikers moving quickly, packs bouncing, talking, laughing. Relief washed over me, but a part of my mind stayed focused on the sticks. How had someone managed to set them up without leaving any other trace? I tried to imagine the logistics, but the possibilities didn't fit together neatly. The forest floor was soft. Any careful person would leave at least a slight impression. I concluded eventually that I had been too focused on my isolation, that my imagination had stitched together the sticks into something more deliberate than it was. Still, I could not shake the memory. The circle had been there, arranged with clear intent, and no one had been around. A week later, I researched camping in that area, looking for reports of other hikers experiencing strange things. I found a few posts from people describing the feeling of being watched or noticing small alterations to their campsites, sticks arranged or rocks moved. Nothing threatening, just odd and unexplained. I filed it away as a warning, something to take seriously if I returned. Returning to the forest after that first night, I realized that the circle had been a test of awareness. Someone could have been observing from a distance, curious to see if I would notice, if I would panic. Or it could have been the work of someone passing through who didn't want to leave evidence of their presence but wanted to leave a mark anyway. Either way, the experience changed how I approached camping. I started checking my perimeter, securing my belongings more carefully, moving in ways that left fewer traces. The forest had not been hostile. There was no one targeting me, but the forest had been unyielding, a reminder that even in the most peaceful settings, human presence could disrupt or unsettle without warning. The circle of sticks remained in my memory longer than anything else from that trip. Not terrifying in a supernatural sense, not violent, just unsettling. It forced me to confront the reality that the world was larger than my understanding, that isolation could be interrupted in the quietest ways. When I returned home, I told a few friends about it, and they dismissed it as coincidence. That was fair. I couldn't prove anything. Yet the image of the sticks, small and deliberate, circled around my sleeping bag in the muted shadows of a forest I thought I knew, stayed with me. I never saw another circle, never encountered anyone else who had done the same. But every time I go back into the woods, I check the ground carefully. I mark my perimeter. I make sure my surroundings are exactly as I left them, because that night taught me that even the smallest changes, the simplest gestures, could create a weighty sense of unease. That was enough. It was enough to know that the forest is alive in ways you can't always see, and that sometimes the most unsettling experiences are the ones that leave no trace beyond your own memory. I haven't returned to that exact clearing, but the forest near the trailhead still calls me, and when I do go back, I walk deliberately. I place my pack carefully, I mark my spot, and I check the ground around me. No one else is there, and no sticks appear, but I carry the memory of that circle like a quiet lesson. There is nothing supernatural about it, nothing threatening, just a reminder that the world moves in ways that can surprise you, and sometimes the simplest things, a few sticks arranged in a circle, can make you feel profoundly aware of your place in it. I leave the forest differently now, always aware that even when alone, you are never entirely so. The lesson is clear. Stay alert, respect the surroundings, accept that not everything has a neat explanation, and carry the memory of the unexplained carefully, like a compass, guiding the way through the quiet and the shadows. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, carrying my pack and the small tent I had spent weeks choosing. The trail had been quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every step feel louder than it should. My dog, a golden retriever I had raised since he was a puppy, trotted beside me with the usual calm energy, sniffing occasionally at the underbrush and occasionally looking back at me as if to make sure I was keeping pace. We had been planning this weekend for months. I wanted to get away from the city, from work, from the constant noise of life, and just sit in the forest for a couple of days. The plan was simple. Hike in, set up camp, spend the evening with a small fire, and wake early the next day to explore the surrounding ridges. The clearing I chose for the tent was small but flat, just enough space for us. I set the tent up quickly, grateful that the ground was dry despite the morning's rain. My dog watched me the entire time, tail wagging, occasionally dropping his head to sniff the earth. I had packed our food and water near the edge of the clearing, out of the way but easily accessible. Once the tent was up, I took a few minutes to let him explore, and he wandered in slow circles around the clearing, sniffing the edges of the trees and underbrush. The forest was alive with subtle sounds, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant rustle of leaves, but nothing that made me uneasy. As the sun lowered behind the ridges, the light shifted to a dull orange, filtering through the high branches. I gathered some small wood for a fire, arranging it carefully in a modest circle to keep it contained. My dog followed me the entire time, sitting near my feet while I worked. When I struck the first match, he stiffened slightly, then relaxed once the flames caught. We ate a small dinner, and I kept the fire low, not wanting to attract too much attention from wildlife. My dog lay down beside me, rolling onto his side and letting out a long sigh that I assumed was contentment. I leaned back on my pack and looked at the darkening forest, enjoying the quiet shift from day to night. It started with subtle changes. My dog, who had spent all day moving freely, suddenly became tense. His ears twitched, and he lowered his body slightly, keeping close to the tent. I followed his gaze and tried to see what he was focused on, but in the dim light, all I could make out were the shadowed shapes of trees and the occasional flicker of a nocturnal animal moving through the underbrush. I thought he might have heard a small creature, squirrels, raccoons, anything that might wander nearby, but there was no rustle, no sign of anything large. As the fire burned lower, he began growling softly, a low rumble that I had never heard from him before. I froze, watching him carefully. He was staring at a single spot just outside the edge of the clearing, where the shadows of the trees thickened. His growl was steady, not frightened, not playful, but deliberate, as if he were warning me to pay attention. I looked around, scanning for movement, the glint of eyes, anything that might explain his reaction. Nothing, just trees, darkness, and the faint smell of wet earth. I tried to calm him, but he wouldn't leave the tent. He stayed at the edge of the flap, muscles tensed, eyes fixed on that one dark spot. I considered packing up and moving, but the night was already fully descended, and hiking in the dark without proper trails felt dangerous. I decided to wait to see if whatever had him unsettled would move on. I stayed quiet, listening to the forest, noting every small noise. The distant drip of water from leaves, the wind brushing against the canopy, the occasional snap of twigs under some unseen foot. My dog's growl never stopped, though it didn't escalate, and I began to notice patterns in the sounds. A footfall, heavy but deliberate, followed by a pause, then nothing. At first, I thought it was a trick of the night, but the rhythm became distinct, deliberate, almost measured. I sat rigid, not daring to make a sound, trying to gauge distance and direction. The footfalls were moving slowly around the clearing, circling, but always keeping just out of view behind the dense shadows. My dog shifted slightly, lowering his body further, still growling, still staring. I considered yelling, making a human noise, but I feared that might provoke whoever was there. The rational part of my mind told me it could be a hiker, maybe a hunter passing late, but the measured pace, the silence between steps, and the careful circling told me otherwise. Something had entered our space, and it was deliberate. Hours seemed to stretch. I kept the fire alive, throwing small twigs to maintain a faint glow. My dog never left the tent, even when I patted the ground beside me, trying to coax him out. I felt a tension in the air that pressed down, thick and heavy, making every snap and rustle sharper than it should have been. I realized I was holding my breath, trying to match his attention. Every shadow could have been someone stepping closer. Every quiet moment felt loaded with expectation. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly, keeping low. The forest was empty. No footprints, no dropped items, no evidence that anyone had been there. Only a few broken branches from the wind. My dog's body relaxed slightly, but he stayed close to me, still alert, still wary. I packed quickly, careful to make no noise, and left the clearing. The trail back was long, but we kept moving. Every now and then I glanced back, but the trees looked empty. It wasn't until we reached the main road that I understood. A local ranger was walking toward us. He asked if I had seen a person near the back trails. I explained I hadn't, only my dog had reacted. He nodded slowly and explained that the area was known for poachers, people who moved quietly, waited, and watched. He said they often left no trace, especially if they thought someone might notice. I realized then that my dog had sensed someone, a human, moving silently outside the clearing all night. I had been lucky. My dog's instinct had kept us safe without me even realizing what was happening. We left the forest that morning with no incident, but the image of those circling shadows stayed with me for weeks. My dog never growled at anything else, and I never questioned his calm demeanor again. He had protected me quietly, without hesitation, and I had learned to trust his instincts in a way I never had before. I arrived at the campground just as the sun was dipping below the ridges, casting long shadows through the pines and maples. The air was dry and cold, carrying the faint scent of decaying leaves and pine resin. I'd been driving for hours, leaving the city behind, looking for a few nights alone in the woods, somewhere quiet to think and reset after a month that had swallowed me whole. The lot was nearly empty, a few cars scattered between thick clusters of trees, and I parked at the far edge where the gravel gave way to soft dirt. My spot had a small clearing, just enough for my tent and the car, and a fire ring with a few stones blackened from past use. I set up the tent as daylight faded, making sure the rainfly was taut and the stakes were firm. I stacked firewood in a neat pile beside the pit and started to organize my small camping stove, my lantern, and the bag of supplies I had brought. The forest around me had grown quiet, only the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the snap of a twig underfoot breaking the silence. As I worked, I glanced at my car, parked just a few feet from the tent, thinking about how the headlights reflected faintly in the darkening clearing. Once my tent was ready, I made a small fire. The flames licked the dry wood, crackling softly, and I watched them for a while, feeling the warmth on my hands and face. The forest darkened quickly. Shadows stretched from every tree, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying a faint chill that sank into my jacket. I ate a simple dinner, then cleaned up, leaving the fire smoldering in the pit. I turned on my lantern and arranged it near the tent entrance so I could see the clearing without fully waking up. That's when I noticed the figure. I froze before I even recognized it as a person. At first, I thought it might be a friend or another camper returning from a hike, but as my eyes adjusted, it became clear they weren't moving. The figure was standing by the driver's side of my car, perfectly still. I scanned the area for any sign of movement, any rustle, any indication they might have been walking, but nothing. They were just standing there, staring toward the edge of the clearing, though I couldn't tell if they had noticed me. My heart rate picked up, and my stomach tightened. I had never felt a presence so heavy in the quiet of the forest. I debated my next move. Part of me wanted to call out, to ask if they needed help or directions, but another part told me that speaking could provoke something I couldn't predict. I didn't know who it was or why they were there, and the isolation of the campground made my options limited. I stayed inside the tent, my body pressed against the floor, my eyes fixed on them through the mesh screen. Every breath I took felt loud, and every rustle of leaves made me tense. They did not shift, step, or turn. The cold settled deeper into me, and I realized I had been holding my breath. Hours passed, though time seemed distorted. I watched the sky darken completely, then slowly lighten as the first hints of dawn began to appear. The fire had burned low, casting weak orange glows that flickered across the clearing. The figure remained in the same spot, rigid and silent. I wondered if they had fallen asleep standing up, or if they were waiting for something, or simply observing. My imagination ran through every possibility, each one worse than the last. But there was no aggression, no sudden movement, nothing to suggest immediate danger, just presence. The forest gradually brightened with morning light. Birds began to call, and small animals emerged from their nests and burrows. The shadows retreated, leaving the clearing in soft golden light. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure was gone. No footprints, no indication of departure, only the faint imprint of the gravel pressed slightly under the tires where I had parked. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I had seen. I inspected my car carefully. Nothing tampered with, no scratches, no damage, no sign anyone had touched it. I walked the perimeter of the clearing and even checked the trees and underbrush nearby. Nothing. It wasn't until I packed up my gear that I noticed something small on the hood of my car. A single, smooth stone, dark and damp, not from the ground under my feet. It looked as if it had been placed there deliberately. I held it for a moment, turning it over in my hands, and a shiver ran through me. It was not threatening, not a note or a weapon, just a small, quiet reminder that someone had been there. I locked the car, left the campsite, and drove away slowly, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The forest receded behind me, and the clearing vanished from sight. Days later, I replayed the memory in my mind repeatedly, trying to make sense of it. The logical explanation seemed most likely. A hiker or camper had arrived during the night and stayed near my car, perhaps lost or disoriented, and left without me noticing. There was no evidence of ill intent, no broken windows, no confrontation. Yet, despite understanding it could have been entirely harmless, the sensation of being watched, the weight of their stillness, lingered. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see them standing there, silent, patient, unmoving until the light forced them to leave. It remained the most unnerving camping experience I had ever had. A simple, human presence that needed nothing more than my attention to unsettle me completely. I decided to go hiking alone after losing my job. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment choice, though the timing felt abrupt. I'd spent the last few weeks confined to my apartment, scrolling through endless news feeds, watching the world continue without me, and feeling the weight of uselessness settle across my shoulders. I packed a small backpack with the essentials: water, a granola bar, a light jacket, my phone, and a notebook I never used. I wanted the forest to absorb me, to take me far from the apartment walls and the echoing silence of unemployment. The trailhead I chose was one I had driven past many times but never explored, a winding path in the hills just beyond the city. It promised isolation, steep enough to tire a person out, but not so remote that I would get hopelessly lost. The morning was gray, with clouds hanging low and a drizzle that blurred the edges of the trees. The air smelled damp, of wet pine and decaying leaves. I started along the path slowly, my boots crunching against the mix of dirt and fallen needles. The rhythm of walking, step after step, was meditative at first. I let my thoughts drift, recalling the small humiliations of my last weeks. The curt tone of my manager, the mounting bills, the way even my friends seemed to step around me as if I were contagious with failure. Hiking felt like an antidote to that, a way to reconnect with something primal and steady, something indifferent to status or income. I followed the trail into a denser section, where the trees grew thick and close together. Their branches formed tunnels over the path, dripping rainwater onto my hood. The forest smelled stronger here, muskier, with the damp earth and the sharp bite of crushed moss underfoot. I noticed how quiet it was, aside from the occasional bird and the distant drip of water from leaves. I felt the usual hum of the city fall away. My mind, which had been buzzing with worry, began to settle. I liked that. I welcomed it. After an hour of walking, I came across a narrow clearing, a small patch where sunlight briefly touched the ground. I stopped, leaned against a tree, and drank some water. That's when I saw them, the footprints. At first, I thought I was imagining things. They were in the soft earth just ahead of me, pressed deeply, like someone had stepped with deliberate force. Then I noticed they continued behind me. I froze. They weren't far off, maybe a few feet behind, but they were unmistakably there. I crouched and examined them. The spacing matched my stride exactly. Same distance, same depth, same direction. I hadn't turned around. No one else was near the trail when I entered. No one was supposed to be here. My pulse quickened, though I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I had walked through some soft patch earlier, or the wind and rain had shifted the soil in a strange way. I shook my head, attempting to refocus on the trail. I started walking again, boots pressing into the mud, careful to leave no footprint too deep behind me. When I glanced back, just once, I saw the prints again, following in perfect alignment. They didn't falter, they didn't stagger. They mirrored my exact steps. I felt a tightness in my chest, a cold prickling along my spine, but I told myself it was rational fear, nothing more. I considered turning back, leaving the trail and heading toward the parking area, but some part of me wanted to understand what I was seeing, so I kept walking. Each step was measured, deliberate, and every time I looked back, the prints remained. I even stopped several times to check the area around me. Nothing, just the forest, silent and patient. The prints did not appear in patches, nor did they wander toward the underbrush. They stayed on the trail. By mid-afternoon, the trail began to climb sharply. My legs ached, my lungs drew the crisp, wet air, and the prince continued faithfully behind me. I began to notice other details I had missed earlier. The faint scrape of branches at shoulder height, the smell of pine resin stronger than before, the uneven pattern of stones that jostled underfoot. I realized that while the prints matched my stride, they were slightly deeper in some areas, as if pressing heavier at certain points. I found myself walking differently, adjusting the angle of my feet, wondering if that would change anything. Didn't. The prints remained. At one point, the trail narrowed along a ridge, steep drop-offs on either side. I gripped a low branch for balance, peering down at the foggy valley below. When I dared to glance back, I noticed something new. The footprints weren't just following my path. They were consistently a half step behind me. Not perfect imitation, but unervingly close, as if someone were deliberately tracking without revealing themselves. I stopped, trying to listen. Nothing except the wind and distant bird calls. My stomach knotted, and for the first time I realized I hadn't felt alone at all, even though the forest was deserted. Hours passed. The daylight waned, turning the forest into a dim, green-gray world. My legs ached, my jacket was soaked through, and I debated whether to keep going. The prints were still there, still aligning with mine, still maintaining that quiet, uncanny presence behind me. I considered leaving the trail entirely, heading off into the underbrush, but I knew the forest's density would make it impossible to navigate in the dark. I kept walking, heart hammering, eyes constantly flicking over my shoulder. Eventually, I reached the peak of the trail. The wind had picked up, rattling branches above. I stood at the top, chest heaving, and finally let myself look around. The clearing was empty. The forest stretched away in all directions, ridges and valleys folding into gray distance. The prints ended there, at the lip of the ridge. I studied the soil carefully. There was no continuation. They stopped. As far as I could see, no one had passed this point except me. I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. I realized then what had happened. The prints had been mine all along. Earlier, when I had become absorbed in the monotony of walking and the haze of my thoughts, I hadn't noticed myself step carefully over soft patches or divert around hidden roots. The rain had exaggerated my impressions. My mind had projected the prints as if someone else were there, following me when it was just me, unknowingly leaving evidence behind. My panic had grown from nothing more than my own awareness of the forest, my own overactive mind replaying fear I carried from life outside the trail. I felt a slow release of tension, almost embarrassed by my own imagination, yet grateful for the clarity. I lingered at the top for a few more minutes, watching clouds shift and the wind stir the treetops. Then I turned back down the trail, stepping deliberately, aware of every impression my boots made, but without fear this time. I carried the memory of the prints with me, a reminder of how easy it is to misread solitude, how quickly our minds turn coincidence into threat. By the time I returned to my car, the forest was quiet, the sky darkening, and I felt a cautious sense of calm, grounded by the fact that I had survived the anxiety I had conjured entirely from my own thoughts. I set out for a weekend alone, carrying only the essentials in a worn backpack. My plan was simple: leave the main trail, find a quiet clearing, and spend the night under the stars. The air was crisp, and the morning light filtered through tall pines, cutting stripes across the narrow dirt path. I passed the usual clusters of hikers and joggers early on, but as the hours passed, the trail emptied. The crunch of my boots on the soft earth was the only sound that broke the stillness, accompanied occasionally by distant bird calls. By late afternoon, the forest felt different. Shadows hung longer, the light slanted sharply between the trunks, and the wind that stirred the upper branches seemed to whisper with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I found a small clearing near a stream, far enough from the path that I could see no sign of anyone else for at least a quarter mile. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles and the occasional rock, but dry. I dropped my pack and surveyed the space. A large, fallen log offered a natural seat. The stream bubbled quietly nearby, its water clear and cold. I unpacked my tent, the fabric still stiff from being rolled tightly for weeks, and set it up with careful precision, making sure the ground was level and the stakes held firm in the soil. By the time I finished, the sun was low, spilling orange and red across the treetops. I started a small fire in a shallow pit I dug near the edge of the clearing. The smoke curled lazily upward, carrying the smell of dry leaves and pine resin. I prepared a simple meal, a dehydrated packet of rice and vegetables. As I ate, I noticed that the forest had gone quiet. Birds were absent, insects seemed to pause, and the gentle rustle of leaves was muted. There was a feeling of distance, as though the forest had pulled back, creating a space where I was entirely alone. Night came quickly, faster than I had anticipated. The air cooled sharply once the sun disappeared, and the darkness pressed close. I retreated into my tent, leaving the fire to smolder. Inside, I could hear the subtle movements outside. A branch snapping in the distance, the crunch of leaves under some small animal, and once, a heavier sound, as if something had shifted its weight on the forest floor nearby. It was close, but not immediately threatening, more like an awareness of another presence. My heart rate increased despite myself. I reminded myself I was deep in the woods, and the occasional noise was natural. Hours passed. I tried to sleep, lying on my pad, listening to the irregular sounds. At one point, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the perimeter of my small clearing. I stayed still, holding my breath. The sound stopped, then resumed, faintly, as if moving away, then returning. I could not see anything. My eyes pressed against the tent wall revealed only darkness. The footsteps repeated, a single, heavy step followed by a pause, then another. I felt the knot in my chest tighten. Something was aware of me, moving carefully, watching, waiting, but I could not place it. I waited for hours, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the sound faded into the natural rhythm of the night. Sleep came only in short, restless bursts. Dawn approached, and the first gray light filtered through the pine canopy. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked unchanged. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing to indicate someone or something had been circling. The fire had burned low, leaving only gray ash, and the ground around the tent appeared undisturbed. I packed quickly, my hands unsteady from lack of sleep. As I walked back toward the main trail, I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see evidence of another presence. There was none. The trail eventually rejoined the path I had started on, and familiar landmarks returned. A fallen bridge, a bend in the stream, the smell of campgrounds nearby. By the time I emerged near the parking area, the world felt normal again, almost mundane. The memory stayed with me. I reviewed it repeatedly in my mind, convinced I must have imagined the steps, or that some animal had moved in a way that mimicked human pacing. But the pattern of the sounds, the timing, the deliberate pauses, it had felt intentional. Yet no evidence remained. I have returned to the area several times since, always during daylight, and I have never heard those steps again. The forest is quiet, peaceful even, with only the occasional sound of a squirrel or a bird. But when I think back to that night, the isolation, the deliberate movements just beyond my sight, I feel the same knot in my chest. It was not supernatural, only human or animal, but the sense of being observed, measured, and studied was undeniable. The forest had a way of making me small, insignificant, and I carry that experience with me every time I hike alone. I had decided to sleep in my truck that night. It wasn't my first choice for camping, but the weather had shifted, and I didn't feel like setting up a tent in the mud after the rainstorm earlier. The truck was old, sturdy, and insulated enough to keep out the cold wind that had been creeping through the pine trees surrounding the clearing. I parked near a bend in the dirt road, far enough from the main trail that I could see nothing but darkness beyond my headlights, which I'd turned off before climbing inside. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap, thick and heavy, and the occasional drip of water from the tree canopy above tapped a slow rhythm on the roof of my truck. I rolled down the window just a fraction to let some fresh air in, the faint scent of smoke from a distant fire lingering somewhere down the valley. I lay across the bench seat with my sleeping bag, listening to the night. The usual forest noises were there. Distant hoots of owls, the scratch of branches moving in the wind, the occasional thump of a small animal running through underbrush. Everything was familiar and ordinary. I had been camping alone for years, and it usually gave me a kind of comfort. I had a small flashlight clipped to the sun visor, my phone fully charged, and a bottle of water within arm's reach. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the rain and the rustle of the trees, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 3 in the morning, I was drifting in and out, my mind half awake and half dreaming. That's when I noticed it. A faint noise, almost imperceptible, like the scraping of metal against metal. My eyes snapped open. My heart tightened in my chest before I could even think. It was the sound of my truck door handle being pulled. Slowly, deliberately testing it. Not jiggling, not a rapid yank, but a careful, steady pressure. Whoever it was seemed patient, almost confident that I wouldn't react immediately. I froze. My body refused to move. I could feel my heart hammering, every beat echoing in my ears louder than the rain. The handle moved again, slower this time, and I realized the person must have been standing just outside, right there in the darkness. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop my eyes from darting toward the window. The faint moonlight and the shadow of the trees meant I could make out nothing more than a dark shape. A figure crouched slightly, hands on the handle. I tried to calculate what I could do. I could reach my phone and call the ranger station, but they were a good 15 minutes away even if I could get through. I could start the truck, but the noise would announce that I was aware, and I had no way of knowing how close they were beyond the door. I could climb over the seat and try to escape out the passenger side, but the ground was soft and wet, and I had no weapon. The handle kept being pulled, slowly, testing it. I counted the seconds in my head, each one stretching unbearably long. A full minute passed. The figure didn't shift or make a sound besides the faint scrape of the handle. My breathing had slowed to almost nothing. I imagined every possibility, my mind running through the worst-case scenarios. Someone looking for valuables, someone lost and desperate, someone more dangerous who had been watching me. I remembered the pack I had on the passenger side, the small hatchet I carried for emergencies, and the spare flashlight. All useless if I couldn't react in time. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure stopped. The figure didn't linger, didn't make any sound, and the handle didn't move again. My heart was still racing, and my hands shook as I gripped the edge of the seat. I waited, every nerve taut, listening for footsteps fading into the darkness, listening for the crunch of leaves under shoes. Nothing came. Not a whisper, not a rustle beyond what the wind already made. I stayed in that position for what felt like hours, even though only 10 minutes passed. Every shadow in the truck, every dark patch outside, seemed alive with the possibility of movement. When I finally dared to move, I reached for the hatchet and flashlight, keeping them in my lap, my back pressed against the seat. The truck felt impossibly small, like a cage, every bump in the road and sway of the suspension magnifying the tension. I wanted to leave, but I knew that any sound might provoke whoever had been there. By dawn, the tension had not eased. The forest was quiet, the rain stopped, and the fog hung low over the clearing. I slowly opened the door just a crack, peering outside. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of movement, nothing disturbed in the mud beyond the tires. Whoever had been testing my door had vanished, leaving me with the absolute certainty that I had been watched. I didn't sleep again that night. I packed up quickly, keeping the hatchet in my hand as I drove down the dirt road. I told myself it could have been an animal, a branch scraping the handle in the wind, anything but a person. But I knew better. The handle had moved deliberately, and only a person could have done that. The fear stayed with me long after I left the forest, in the quiet moments when I reached for my truck door at home or parked somewhere isolated. I never returned to that clearing, and I never slept in a vehicle alone at night again. The memory of that minute, just a minute of deliberate testing pressure, was enough to make me cautious for the rest of my life. I set out for a weekend alone, carrying only the essentials in a worn backpack. My plan was simple. Leave the main trail, find a quiet clearing, and spend the night under the stars. The air was crisp, and the morning light filtered through tall pines, cutting stripes across the narrow dirt path. I passed the usual clusters of hikers and joggers early on, but as the hours passed, the trail emptied. The crunch of my boots on the soft earth was the only sound that broke the stillness, accompanied occasionally by distant bird calls. By late afternoon, the forest felt different. Shadows hung longer, the light slanted sharply between the trunks, and the wind that stirred the upper branches seemed to whisper with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I found a small clearing near a stream, far enough from the path that I could see no sign of anyone else for at least a quarter-mile. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles and the occasional rock, but dry. I dropped my pack and surveyed the space. A large, fallen log offered a natural seat. The stream bubbled quietly nearby, its water clear and cold. I unpacked my tent, the fabric still stiff from being rolled tightly for weeks, and set it up with careful precision, making sure the ground was level and the stakes held firm in the soil. By the time I finished, the sun was low, spilling orange and red across the treetops. I started a small fire in a shallow pit I dug near the edge of the clearing. The smoke curled lazily upward, carrying the smell of dry leaves and pine resin. I prepared a simple meal, a dehydrated packet of rice and vegetables. As I ate, I noticed that the forest had gone quiet. Birds were absent, insects seemed to pause, and the gentle rustle of leaves was muted. There was a feeling of distance, as though the forest had pulled back, creating a space where I was entirely alone. Night came quickly, faster than I had anticipated. The air cooled sharply once the sun disappeared, and the darkness pressed close. I retreated into my tent, leaving the fire to smolder. Inside, I could hear the subtle movements outside. A branch snapping in the distance, the crunch of leaves under some small animal, and once, a heavier sound, as if something had shifted its weight on the forest floor nearby. It was close, but not immediately threatening, more like an awareness of another presence. My heart rate increased despite myself. I reminded myself I was deep in the woods, and the occasional noise was natural. Hours passed. I tried to sleep, lying on my pad, listening to the irregular sounds. At one point, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the perimeter of my small clearing. I stayed still, holding my breath. The sound stopped, then resumed, faintly, as if moving away, then returning. I could not see anything. My eyes pressed against the tent wall revealed only darkness. The footsteps repeated, a single, heavy step followed by a pause, then another. I felt the knot in my chest tighten. Something was aware of me, moving carefully, watching, waiting, but I could not place it. I waited for hours, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the sound faded into the natural rhythm of the night. Sleep came only in short, restless bursts. Dawn approached, and the first gray light filtered through the pine canopy. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked unchanged. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing to indicate someone or something had been circling. The fire had burned low, leaving only gray ash, and the ground around the tent appeared undisturbed. I packed quickly, my hands unsteady from lack of sleep. As I walked back toward the main trail, I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see evidence of another presence. There was none. The trail eventually rejoined the path I had started on, and familiar landmarks returned. A fallen bridge, a bend in the stream, the smell of campgrounds nearby. By the time I emerged near the parking area, the world felt normal again, almost mundane. The memory stayed with me. I reviewed it repeatedly in my mind, convinced I must have imagined the steps, or that some animal had moved in a way that mimicked human pacing. But the pattern of the sounds, the timing, the deliberate pauses, it had felt intentional. Yet no evidence remained. I have returned to the area several times since, always during daylight, and I have never heard those steps again. The forest is quiet, peaceful even, with only the occasional sound of a squirrel or a bird. But when I think back to that night, the isolation, the deliberate movements just beyond my sight, I feel the same knot in my chest. It was not supernatural, only human or animal, but the sense of being observed, measured, and studied was undeniable. The forest had a way of making me small, insignificant, and I carry that experience with me every time I hike alone.